Thank you for having me here. So happy to come for a second time now. So that's great. So the topic I decided to talk about this specific topic is because it turns out to be a very, very common question or problem that we observe. And so also in the LeSS adoptions, also within the LeSS community, there is a quite often misunderstanding or inability to somehow combine the two messages. And which is on one hand, you have a product community all into product discovery, etc. And then you have a LeSS, which doesn't seem to talk about the product at all, or product discovery. And then also there is in LeSS, in an issue message, we don't want to have a product managers and no product managers, only one product owner. And so how does it all actually working out? And also in lots of LeSS adoptions, we notice that basically there is a specific problem happening a lot, which I'll explain. And so for that reason, I chose this to kind of demystify that and also explain from stories how that actually works. And maybe also set a stage for conversations later to see how do we feel about this. In any case, in my view, this is a very, very common question and a problem that happens. Now, I'm talking about the problem right now, or a question right now, but actually yesterday after dinner, I was working with Gojko and we basically concluded this has been a problem for forever. And it's nothing new really. And you'll discover why. Because ever we started product development, at some point when it became more complex, we ended up with this waterfall and roles and responsibilities. And we're still there, but we somehow now keep relabeling the problem, but not really solving it yet. Okay. Now, nowadays, every time I do a talk or a training, I start with this statement. Because just a reminder, it seems obvious, but let me just in case remind us. There's something called assumption of knowledge. And we have on one hand, people who basically assume when we hire people, they know what they are talking about. They know how to do their job. And also when you talk to the stakeholders, customers, they're supposed to know what they actually want. And then you organize yourself accordingly. This is a very fundamental assumption. Okay, so on one hand, we probably in this audience, everybody kind of agrees is probably the second one is much more common, right? So we don't actually know what we need and we do not know how to actually build it. It's obviously not entirely true, but you get the point. So you know technology stuff, but until you start building and you figure out, oh, yeah, we missed this, we missed that. And so we create this thing called Agile in order to slap us all the time and tell us how idiotic we are. That's basically what Agile is all about. It's just acknowledging that you're an idiot. Okay. Now let's say we assume and we agree on this part, okay, that we are idiots. If we know that, then we also want to create a system which essentially maximizes killing bad ideas over delivering as many as possible. Understand? So this is quite fundamental assumption then, that if we truly embrace the fact that we don't know much, then automatic consequence of that is that whatever ideas that we have are very likely bad ideas. So it becomes quite idiotic to try to deliver as many as possible. Okay. Good. Hold that thought. Let me tell you a story about how to envision a product or capability together. And what I mean by that is basically you don't have this separation between different people and different roles. Now, the story is about a company. The company doesn't really matter. It's in Indonesia, but I actually have several of these stories I'm going to tell. In this case, it's about bank. And this bank, one of the new initiatives they have is called family banking. What it means, essentially, it's really vague. everybody has a family, or almost everybody, and they have often kids and stuff. And in that family, it's typically we don't actually see family really as a something that should be concerned with the finances, meaning like the whole family. It's a more kind of like there is somebody in the family taking care of finances. But what about actually kids? Okay, what about inside the family? Do we provide anything or solving the problems which are actually there, such as, for example, education of the children when it comes to financial literacy? And so it's a very vague problem. Now, at the same time, during this problem that came up, they also wanted to have a bunch of new teams, which are actually from existing company, or existing part of the company, which didn't go well, and so they wanted to embrace into the LeSS adoption. And so they asked me, can you help them actually transform into feature teams? And what I did together with them is that we decided, no, let's not do that yet. What we're going to do is, before we do anything organizationally, let's actually get them as deep as possible into the customer perspective. How are we going to do that? So they're thinking immediately is because these people are really developers who don't know anything, just coding, and they are very much under pressure previously to deliver. Very much contract game, never get involved in any customer perspective whatsoever. And so the thinking is we need to prepare them because they are incapable of thinking from a customer point of view. So I said, let's do exactly the opposite. So before actually teaching them anything, we actually are just going to throw this problem to them and see what happens. And so this is the problem they're actually going to work on. And so we're talking about the 50 people, by the way. So it's not a minor group. And we throw the problem. And so the thinking is we need to prepare. So we need to prepare material or research, blah, 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 for the family banking and capabilities, requirements, all this kind of stuff. And I said, let's not do that. And don't prepare anything. And what I mean by prepare is I mean invent requirements or make up shit. So it's not an actual thing. Yeah. So somebody sits and thinks very hard what the family wants. Okay. So not a good idea, especially if it's only one person. So instead, I said, why let one person do that? Why don't we actually give to all these people, especially they have lots of families themselves? And we organized a workshop, and this is literally what happened. I told them, you have one item, this is the item that I just mentioned, family banking. And you're going to form the groups, small groups, and each of the groups will start working on that item, that one single item. And so that was a part of facilitation also to how to do that. So basically, each of the small groups will need to actually think out of the box and explain from the situation and what family banking could mean. Now, how did it happen? This picture you're actually quite familiar with. So this is typically, this is what happened in this group, and it's quite commonly actually I do in other groups very often, in order to get people with the both legs into the customer space. But it's not the only approach, it's just one of them, okay? So in this case, they created the personas, they went through the scenarios, thinking about how does it play out in the real life, and sharing with each other. There's a converge, diverge. My key point is not to explain this approach, which you're probably familiar with, but to actually talk about that this is done together. So it's not done by product managers, it's not done by some customer research people, whatever. It's done by the teams together with key subject matter experts, okay, which are needed in order to provide some information which is already there. Okay. Now, one thing which I do want to light out is this value part and how I do it. I'm using quite often language. Yeah. And who's familiar with language? Few people. Yeah. I think it's very worth learning this technique. It's from Tom Gilb. To be honest, I try to read Tom Gilb's work. It's really hard. It's extremely complicated. So I kind of simplified it. And this is also his part of this simplification, but I simplified even further, which is essentially a way to force you to really be more clear what the heck do you want, quantified which customer problem we're actually solving. Idea behind is that the customer doesn't really want a feature. They want to improve something. And what is that something that you want to improve? Now, quite often it's vague, and this technique helps us actually to make it more clear. Now, they quite often get stuck, but the question is why they get stuck in order to identify this kind of stuff is quite usually because they don't really know what they're exactly trying to improve. And what exactly are we talking about? So this is an example. You can see here a tag, just an explanation actually what it is, a scale, how you're going to measure that, on which scale. Then how you're going to measure with which tool you're going to measure it. Okay, and then the minimum level, if you don't reach that, is basically a failure. A plan, that would be really great, and a current one that we have right now. So you need to have a data about how it is actually going on right now. Yeah, obviously this begs the question, do you have the data? And that becomes really important if you have a discussion, like where does, to get that data. So the teams also are involved in that kind of activities. This just the example of that. Learnable, the ease of learning to use a system, time required for a novice to complete one item using only the online help system, measurements obtained on 100 novices, etc. Okay. So it's a quite simple technique, and but turned out to be quite useful. Now, then, by the way, this technique I used a different context, different story, also used in just traditional banking. This case was Société Générale, and you're probably familiar with, and this part of the world. And so it's a very traditional bank, huge. And the way we did it was a group of teams, again, about 50 people. In this case, it was market access teams. So providing access to the market. And so instead of having these individual objectives, etc., at the beginning of the year, we have the business really high up on a business side, somebody present what they try to achieve. And then it becomes a conversation with the engineers of how we're actually going to achieve that and what kind of measurements do we need to put in place to do that. And they use this also in the performance objectives thing. So instead of having individual performance objectives, which are quite ridiculous quite often, on a level, on detail level, they actually use these same ones for everybody, which are very much on an outcome level. Okay, so how we're going to make a difference for the customer, and they typically how does it result? This technique is you start at the top level, and then it kind of like becomes a tree. So there is you have a top level one, but then you ask like in order to achieve this one, what kind of things do we need to quantify on a lower level, which is going to support the bigger one. Again, the point is not to have this perfect picture of this. The point is to use this as a conversation, okay, so that you start to understand each other better. Now, back to Jago situation. They're going through this process, and in this process, this actual picture from family banking. It's Indonesia, and at the end of the process, at some point, they start to define the backlog. And this all happens in a matter of about 2 days, by the way. And normal refinement is 1 day, but when you have something so large, sometimes we do 2-day refinement. Now, this obviously, you're probably familiar with, when you say every sprint you spend up to 1 day refining, the typical remark back in the beginning is like, that's a 10% of our capacity of a sprint, which could have been doing a real work. So that remark I get over and over again. Okay, and that real work is staring at the black IntelliJ screen. It's always black nowadays, and and if it's not IntelliJ, some multi, but it's black. That's what matters. Okay, so staring at it, and that they call useful work. Yeah. So this is a problem that we're trying to now solve for 100 years, ever since the Taylorism, because. What they refer to as useful work is basically executing as being told. And so to quote Bas Fodder, the problem that we're trying to address with this talk also is a problem which has been exist for 100 years. So focusing on so-called useful work executing by somebody else being told. And then how long is it going to take before we fix the problem? And Bas says another 100 years. So I'm not very hopeful we're going to fix it by having a talk like this. But anyway, we keep trying. So they together at some point end up with a backlog. Keep in mind, these people are not some kind of a special roles and expert. Most of them just engineers who never talk about the customer perspective. And now, out of blue, they're basically full on into this customer perspective. Now, a common argument against this that I got also before this session is, but these people lack a lot of knowledge and experience on how to do this. Okay, so they're going to create some backlog or some information which is not going to fly in reality. It doesn't happen in reality, or it's going to be bad. Now, this is the key thing. The assumption is that if you put somebody who's more expert in this kind of exploration, like a really educated product managers, they're going to be actually delivering something which is good. And now I need to go back to my first slide, assumption of knowledge. Understand? So in this case, does it actually matter they produce, this backlog, what they produce here, is it good? No, that doesn't matter, because we know it's bad by definition. It's always bad. There is no way around that. It's about exploring and getting as much information as possible and sharing the knowledge that we have. It's about also acknowledging what we don't know. So the biggest result out of this session is for them to realize, oh, we now have a list of stuff that we should actually try to know. And actually, these items here, many of them are just questions. Which, if you'll ask me, one of the best backlogs that I've seen is just a bunch of questions. It's not actual stuff to build. Again, first slide, assumption of knowledge. So, they spent 2 days doing that, and at some point they finished it. And later on, some of this stuff actually started to go in the direction, and some others started to change. But nobody questions in retrospect the usefulness of this session, because it immediately got engineers immersed into the customer perspective. The big effect of that also, that engineers start to understand the importance of doing that. Otherwise, if you don't do that and you start doing a less adoption, what you end up with is complain immediately, why do I need to waste my time talking about the customer? Let product managers do that. Another thing that happened is we did a customer immersion or ideation day. For some reason, they call it ideation day. And this was just one slice of the video. There's lots of videos of how this happened. Let me tell you a story. They go actually in groups, small groups, outside on a street. So there's one day which they organize. They go outside on the street, and it's a Jago, it's an app that basically for banking being used. And it's internet banking. So they have people interview on a street potential customers or customers. And who are those who are interviewing? It's actually developers who do that. But not only developers, also other people, obviously. So there's some even managers and PMs, etc., etc. So there's no like a distinction in the roles whatsoever. And they typically form the groups of a mixed group. So few developers, few whatever, etc. roles. And they start to interview. In this case, they go in a shop, and one part of that app also that shopkeepers or shop owners would also use the app in order to transact, etc., with the customers coming into the shop. And so they interview and try and show them how to use that. And so they install at the spot. They actually go through the process of installing and figuring out how to use the app. During the process, the developers notice it doesn't work. And then something which everybody assumed it's obviously working, it doesn't actually work. And so instead of having other people doing this customer research and then going to developers and whatever, product owners saying, convince, yeah, but you need to do this, you need to do that. It makes the process very inefficient, ironically. It makes it more efficient if you have developers talk to the customers directly. Another, a really strange reason that I hear all the time why not involve developers is because it's more efficient. The reality is exactly the opposite. Yeah. So if you involve developers directly with the customer, you actually make it more efficient because you kill all these queues and translations and handoffs. Okay? But obviously it's going to be cost of staring at the intelligence screen. So then they would spend this whole day, and then would come back and have lots and lots of ideas, which actually then end up suggestions for in the backlog. Does it mean that it immediately start to be built? No, it's the product owner which at the end decides whether actually it's going to be prioritized or not. So another story, and this is actually from Netherlands, Port of Rotterdam, quite an old story. And so what happens, and not in only this story, but quite many of them also, it's these collaborative practices, and that's my key message. One of them you recognize from Gojko, the impact mapping. And for me, the key thing about these practices, they are collaborative. So I don't know if I misunderstand the impact mapping, but for me, the only way and the best way to do impact mapping is if you do it together with others and not by yourself. And then just to give, this is actually a bunch of developers. They are doing this real-time following a ship in a harbor and what happens in a harbor. So it's kind of like a traffic control, but for the ships. And this is actually the app that is being used, and they're talking here with the customer and seeing this is basically the same group. And showing how it's being used, learning from that. It's just a normal day in life. And when does this happen, by the way? This is just a normal sprint work. So the item in the backlog that the team picks up and executes in a sprint is basically go talk to the customer and figure out something. That's a normal backlog item. Okay? That happens all the time. Because if you pick up a question from a backlog, how do you answer the question? Well, you go talk to this part of the sprint work in order to answer the question. Now you notice this vagueness that start to exist between refinement versus the sprint work. And that's intentional, that's on purpose, that we actually intentionally make it so vague. So this is a product box. I'm not sure how exactly the term is. So you basically create a box and you start to envision all kinds of things and you visualize that. It's a very old practice. It's inspired by Microsoft. And because they used to make those boxes for Windows and they're very colorful on all sides. And so that was inspired by that. Let's, for our product, create a box which is going to be packaging the end product. So this is what, these are basically, this is a developer and some other people also there. With the subject matter experts, in this case, Port of Rotterdam, it's basically people from the harbor who are going on the ships and helping the ships to navigate through the harbor. They also participate in this workshop together with developers. Now, the key thing about it is really, the way conversation happens is not basically those experts come to the workshop and they start to tell developers how it is, and then developers start to ask question how. That's kind of like a forbidden question. What would you like to have, and how should it work? Those are kind of like a forbidden questions. Yeah, and so instead, is basically it's kind of like a mind melt. You want to actually put yourself as a developer with both legs into the space of that user, and then see how does it actually work happens, not how the product should be. And then basically developers themselves suggest the approach to the problem and how to actually solve it. And then you have this conversation which is driven by developers, not by the experts. Okay. Now, why do we do that? This is the actual picture. This actually happened. There's an expression in Dutch, which is the gouden kraan, or golden faucet. And so there was literally, this is like the main manager of the whole group. And this is the harbor master. It's kind of like a highest authority in the harbor when it comes to decision making. And at the end of it was quite successful, and he gave this golden faucet, which we finally give you something that you do not need. Yeah. So everything there was about actually delivering as little as possible to the customer, which is a strange idea. Yeah. Only the stuff that you actually need. Therefore, what's the secret? How do you actually make this happen? What's the problem that why do I have this talk in the first place? It's actually how we organize the work which makes it possible. Okay, it's not really, everybody probably agrees here that it's great to do that in such a way, but how do I actually make it happen? Well, it starts with actually understanding that you need to be very, very sensitive for sequential work. And so the more you're sensitive and more to see sequential work, the better you're going to be able to do something about it. Let me show now typical modern way of doing product development. And I'm talking about this upper part. And I purposely created this picture in order to show, and they call it agile also, by the way. But you can see on a picture already the problem. So it starts with some kind of ideation, customer research. And there's a separate people typically who do that. Sometimes product managers, sometimes some other people. It doesn't really matter. So it's a separate people, okay? And then somehow they start to define what problem they should be actually solving. They're writing these PRD documents or user stories. You see, I'm using all this modern agile terminology here. And then you have a UX designers, which are typically outside of the teams. And they create a UX design. And what happens to UX design or PRD documents? There's steps in between usually, which is approval by the management. Okay? And then if you're not unlucky enough, then they start to prototype. And that prototype then gets approved by the management. And then it goes into refinement. Okay? And then in refinement, what can you do actually? Well, then becomes a really contra game. Deliver, deliver, deliver. Yeah. And good luck with the customer perspective. It's completely gone. So, and the teams are essentially kind of focused on that. And we call this agile. So my suggestion is something dramatically different. And it becomes my suggestion to have a discussion how far you can go and what stands in the way to make it happen, and whether it's a good idea also, is essentially try to do everything at the same time, in parallel. So not sequential way of working. Okay, so obviously you have something like a refinement where you go through all of these steps essentially at the same time. Not literally at the same time, but within the same session. You each iterate over it very quickly. But it doesn't mean that you stop there. For example, you have some kind of ideation, but during the ideation or thinking, hey, the problem is we think is actually this, but let's test it because we're idiots, remember? So what are we going to do? Well, there's all kinds of questions. The first question is whether the user is actually going to use it. Is it really useful? Okay. So indeed, we might need to have a prototype. And so that becomes potentially work in a sprint. Okay. But also, and this is really, really important, is it technically actually going to work? And what I mean by that is not whether it's technically feasible to make it happen, but how the technical implementation is going to affect how a user uses it. And this is really important that I see going wrong a lot. So they create a prototype, different people from developers, and they show this prototype, which is really realistic. This is nowadays advice to make a really realistic prototype, except technically it's not actually potentially feasible. And then it gets presented and it looks nice, it's great. And when it goes in development, developers say like, this is such a bad idea. Yeah. It becomes really expensive, etc., etc. Or because they need to compromise because it's technically too expensive or whatever, the end product starts to be different from the prototype. Okay, so you essentially want to combine that, do this together in order to discover this stuff much sooner, much cheaper. Yeah. So it's then even during the sprint, you keep asking the same questions again. So we assumed we need to use this technology, but does it actually work? If not, stop. Rethink again. Use daily Scrum to discuss this kind of stuff. Okay. Another problem that I see often is a confusion about when I say suggestions should work together. Everybody said, yeah, of course we work together. How does it work together? Well, every prototype, whatever we do, we ask from engineers to give feedback. So dynamic, how it goes is I'm asking you for feedback, but I already built all of this. It becomes a painful one, especially in Asia, where people it's okay, don't bother. Because why the heck did you do it like this? It's not really a nice conversation starter. In Netherlands, let me use an extreme opposite example, is they start to ask why and everybody gets annoyed. Waste of time to now revisit again. Yeah, we already spent so much time talking about this, let's get over with it, etc. Okay. Now, the collaboration, the reason why you really don't want us to start prepare work for the teams and start before you do anything, bring the problem to the teams in order to actually collaborate. Okay, so that you don't end up in this fake feedback thing. Prototyping. I mentioned prototyping is a problematic. I don't have anything against prototyping, but the way it happens is a problem. So there's assumption that defining without developers and testing a prototype, what I mean by testing prototype is showing to the users and having users try it out as a realistic prototype. It's nowadays a very popular practice. Gives sufficient knowledge to deliver a feature. Okay. Obviously, you should do prototyping in order to discover what the user should be doing, but it does not give you sufficient information whether a feature should be delivered. You'll still need to say, we are idiots, we don't know if it's actually going to be a good solution. That's why I iterate also technically. An idea can only be truly tested when it's technically delivered. So when you embrace this way of working, then also incentivize you to really merge things together. Because if you keep it separate, then it's very difficult to say, we acknowledge this statement. Okay? Because it becomes very expensive to test. And when I mean testing, I'm not technically testing, but testing whether it's actually a user going to use something. Misplaced perception from stakeholders that are almost there. You're very familiar with that problem. It's a very old problem. I don't need to explain. Avoid prototype approvals. Okay, so you create a prototype is to learn, is not to approve. As soon as you approve, it's a sign that you basically end up with the trap of we know what we want. Try design prototype together with a team as just an ordinary artifact, as I just mentioned. Try favor small product increment that addresses also technical risks. Because we don't know we don't know a lot, you actually increment in as small as possible increments so that you discover whether you're actually going in the right direction. Okay, but also technically. So, the last one dropped out for some reason. Oh no, that's the next one, sorry. So, what about UX designers? It's a similar problem. And so, I mean, I just now talk about, and I didn't mention explicitly product managers here. Why? There's nothing wrong with having people, and we should have more and more with the proper product management skills and experience. This is extremely important. The problem is when you put them in a box and separate from the rest. This is the problem I'm trying to address. Okay? Same with UX designers. I'm not saying that everybody can do UX design. That's an actual skill and experience. It's not something that's trivial. Just like development, same thing. But don't put them in a box and separate from the rest. So assumption, designers cannot be in a team since there are not enough of them. You can. It's a collaboration that happens. And there's nothing wrong having developers also suggestions about design, etc. And then a designer checks that or mentors that, etc. Assumption, designers should be outside teams since they are looking at the bigger picture and not single feature. Well, that's a misunderstanding that the feature team means a single feature. It's not. It's just a customer end-to-end feature that they are delivering. You're probably familiar with that. But the teams obviously need to look at the bigger picture. Now, if you have a component teams or specialized teams, this is a problem. And that then becomes a good reason for designers to be outside. But that the problem is basically that you have a wrong structure. The teams are not looking at the product level. They are looking basically at something tiny. The very popular is the value stream teams, which I still haven't figured out what that means. So unless having designers outside of teams leads to, this is a really, they observe over and over again, when you have a product managers and designers outside of the team, it leads to a really strange situation. One of the courses, I have a designer in really after a few years of a LeSS adoption. And a designer says after during the course, somehow he misunderstood what I was explaining. He said, "Oh, I really hope after this course that finally my designs are going to be used, which I've been working for 4 years on." So he literally has been working for years on design separately from the rest. And then he hopes that it's going to be actually used. Now, in LeSS adoption, the way decision-making happens about designs is basically the AP or PO drives the prioritization, and everything follows. Now, if you work as a designer separately, you can see the problem here. So whatever you make is just not synced with what is being prioritized, which is changing all the time. The same with the program managers. When they start to spend lots of time preparing some kind of a PRE or whatever it is, or a research without the teams, likelihood of actually nothing happening to that is very, very high. So you must be involved in the process, and the most optimal way to do that is be part of the teams for that reason. Otherwise, it becomes a very strange situation. Try wireframing together with the other team members. Try work on details after product idea is first discussed in refinement, as I mentioned. Okay, this one also mentioned. Avoid using Figma and other fancy tools to collaborate on design. Again, nothing against the Figma, that's actually a more administrative tool, as I call it, which means you want to actually create something at some point which is visually appealing for prototype reasons, for all kinds of reasons. But don't use these fancy tools for collaboration. I just don't see that happening. There's no collaboration. If somebody creates these fancy pictures and they start to then demonstrate, and then they ask developers, do you have feedback? There's no collaboration there. So either you end up with, why did you do that? Why don't you change it? Why? It becomes a really strange meeting. Or they just simply say, you know what, whatever. Yeah, let's move on. It's good. And they start to ask how questions. Now, another one. So this is a more what I noticed in the community. So I explain now how this can be done mainly, but what I noticed in the community is lots of these things. And the most very prominent one that you're familiar with is the double diamond thing. Okay? Which is creating essentially this separation, no matter how much you say it's not. So I quite often ask, like, don't you see the problem with this diamond down? They say, no, this is collaborative. How exactly? Yeah. So if it's truly collaborative, you don't need a double diamond. It's a one iteration altogether, everything. Yeah, it becomes automatically, this is a separate people from these. And it's a handoff. It's a sequential process. It's what we used to call waterfall. Now, these are the statements from a prominent, I'm not going to mention the names, prominent people from product community. Most product people today do seem to understand the concept that in product discovery, we're building to learn, and in product delivery, we're building to earn. Do you see the division? Yeah, as if after building to learn, you are kind of done. Now we just need to build it to earn it, meaning delivery. That's what I mean by the teams, by the software engineers. Another one, once we have discovered a solution worth building, then we can proceed to build and deliver a product quality solution, one that is blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Same problem. Once we have the necessary evidence that we have discovered a solution worth, we now need to communicate to the engineers the many details of the necessary product. It's like a literally Taylorism. Yeah. Okay. So instead of doing that, let's try to do everyone, everything, everywhere, all at once. Thank you.